We turn our attention now to the national conference. Even though President Jonathan has said that the sole motivation for the conference is a patriotic desire for a better nation, there are people who still question his motive. There are also questions of legitimacy and what issues should be discussed. Senior Advocate of Nigeria, Femi Falana, is one of the delegates representing the civil society at the conference. In this interview segment, he gives his perspective on the motive, agenda, and outcome, and much more. You've been quoted as saying that the president has the right to convoke this national conference, but there are those who doubt the motives of the president. Some people feel that it's geared towards giving him an undue advantage in the 2015 general elections, especially when you consider at first that Nigerians were told that the conference will work out modalities for integrating its deliberations into the constitution. And then the president at the inauguration came out to say that there's a provision for a referendum. The CNPP especially thinks that it is more or less an afterthought or a double speak, which is geared at derailing the 2015 general elections. You are a delegate at this conference. Do you have any doubts as to the motive of the president?
People have to appreciate that the campaign for a sovereign national conference in Nigeria actually began in 1989. At that time, after decades of military dictatorship in Africa, the resort to SNC became an avenue to unseat, sovereign national conference, to unseat dictators that had hijacked the political process in the country. In Benin Republic, Togo, Congo, and some other two African countries, people opted for a sovereign national conference, which in the course of the proceedings acquired the life of its own. Under the leadership of Alao Aka Bashorun as NBA president, we got a wonderful support in the campaign. So by 1990, September 1990, we were going to hold the national conference at the National Theatre. Worried that that conference might end the same way it had ended in other African countries. The Babangida junta threatened us with treason. Incidentally, Professor Brian Nwabweze, SAN, Shifolu Falai, Professor Jibril Aminu and others were in that government. That was also when the government displayed empty arrogance by saying there was no alternative to the IMF World Bank imposed structural adjustment program. So that campaign had been on since then. The annulment of the June 12, 1993 election gave it some fillip. And of course, at that time we were not thinking of a conference of ethnic nationalities. We wanted a conference of the Nigerian people to debate essentially who gets what, when, and how. It's not about rotating power among various factions of the ruling class. No. But along the way, the concept of the conference was hijacked by politicians of different ideological hues.
Everybody had their motives for wanting.
Oh, yes. Since then, every regime had always rejected the idea of a sovereign national conference. President Goodluck Jonathan, of course, has never been an exception. But because the campaign had been intensified as a result of the desperation of certain centripetal and centrifugal forces to tear the country apart. Of course, We're witnessing an era of kidnapping, militancy, terrorism, and other violent crimes. The ruling class was therefore compelled to say, we had better convene this conference and sit down to discuss. I think it was at that stage that the president became a convert. As a matter of fact, you were in Calabar, at our conference in Calabar, at the opening ceremony, the president of the Senate, Senator David Mark.
This is at the NBA conference?
Yes, last year, kicked against the idea of the conference. But 3 weeks later, the regime opted for the conference. And the Senate leadership now said, why not?
So there's no basis for doubting the motive?
No, I don't think there is a basis. As far as I'm concerned. And that is why, with profound respect to Professor Nwabweze, SAN, we have to differentiate between legality and legitimacy. If you look at Section 5 of the Constitution, of course, the president can convene a meeting as part of his executive powers. And if you go further to the fundamental rights provision, there's freedom of expression, there's freedom of assembly, freedom of association. So you can convene a meeting.
There are those who also doubt the legitimacy of the conference vis-a-vis the National Assembly, who are the representatives of the people. What happens in a situation of conflict on any issue if the National Assembly decides one way and the conference goes the other way? Which one would prevail?
From the look of things, I don't think it is in the interest of the National Conference to give the impression that it is competing with the National Assembly. If you do that, they will strike down every resolution, however profound it may be. So we have to be very tactical in mobilizing the National Assembly to appreciate that what is being done at the National Conference ultimately will be geared towards resolving some of the intractable crises that have brought Nigeria to our knees. If the National Assembly, with respect, had been able to address those problems of insecurity, of unemployment, of infrastructural decay, and the rest of them, in the last 14 years or thereabout, nobody will have, in his widest imagination, conceived or continued to campaign for a sovereign national conference. So, to that extent, the National Assembly will have to work hand in hand with the National Conference or vice versa. I take one for instance. The president has just approved the appointment of 25 judges of the High Court who have just been elevated, appointment of 25 justices for the Court of Appeal. Since the judges involved were working in the High Court, all their cases, hundreds of cases, thousands of cases, no matter the stage
at which they are,
at which they are, have to
yes,
be started de novo. That is a lot of waste. Now, we must find a way out. The National Assembly hasn't addressed that. But I've just discovered from the experience, from what happens in Ghana, that once you are elevated to the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court, you get a fear to go back, to return to the High Court or the Court of Appeal to conclude all your cases.
Is this before swearing in or after?
After you have been sworn in. And you are now sitting as a justice of the Court of Appeal.
Then you come back to the
You
High
go
Court.
back to the High Court to complete all your cases.
All.
In the interest of the system.
All the cases,
Oh
no
yes,
matter what
except,
stage.
no, well, particularly those that are already on
close.
trial.
Okay.
I mean, in which trial had commenced. Now,
Close to judgment.
yeah, I cannot see the National Assembly kicking against that. Because that will save us a lot of cost.
So this is one of the recommendations
Of course.
that the conference will
Of
do.
course. So, I don't think there will be any basis to say, oh, whatever comes from there, we're going to kick against it. We have to cross-fertilize ideas.